So when we're talking about communication, we're talking about how are we actually conveying messages or thoughts that we have. We will focus primarily on the verbal communication, as that's what we're doing, and today is about talking to children and young people, but obviously there are different modalities of communication. When we're thinking about communication, people define it differently and they talk about different components, but the general consensus is that there are these sort of 4 aspects to communication. The first one is speech. That's how we say words and how we make sounds. Difficulties in this area may constitute a speech problem, a speech disorder. So that would be things like stuttering, difficulties with articulation, etc. And then we have the 2 important concepts of expressive and receptive language. So expressive language is our ability to put a thought or an idea into words to be understood by another person. And receptive language is our understanding of information. And you'll hear those a lot. Difficulties in those areas may be considered a language disorder. So speech and or language disorders would be treated by speech therapists and speech pathologists, who can be a wonderful resource if you are working with children who do have a disorder or you're concerned may have a disorder, in terms of coming up with specific strategies that are individualised for that child. The last component of language that we talk about is the non-verbal component, and that is how do we use our face and our bodies to convey a message. You may hear lots of different statistics thrown around. One of the most popular ones is that 93% of all communication is non-verbal. That comes from work from a specific researcher, and there's a lot of contention about what is the exact statistic and how do we quantify that. It's very difficult, almost impossible to quantify, given the variability in human behaviour. And one could ask, is it actually a useful thing to know specifically what statistic might quantify non-verbal communication? The important message is that the majority of what we communicate is not the words that we choose. So how do we learn to communicate? Lots of people have kind of looked at this, and there's a couple of groups in the US doing some research around it. One group is looking at actually studying infants and how they learn to discriminate sounds. At around the age of 6 months, infants can discriminate sounds of all of the languages of the world. Something shifts at about the age of 8 to 10 months, and from 8 to 10 months, infants can only discriminate the sounds of the language of the culture in which they're raised. So it's quite interesting, and we as adults are very much culture-bound learners. We can only discriminate the sounds of the language in which we're raised, have been raised, and that could be more than one language for people who are bilingual. So this research group has looked at, well, can we actually affect that by exposing children to other sounds? And they used one of the Chinese languages, Cantonese, and they had 3 different groups of infants. So in one group of infants, they exposed them to a Cantonese-speaking lady, and she read them books and interacted with them and played with them and spoke the whole time. The other group was the same lady, but it was all via television, and I think the third group was audio of those interactions. And then they restudied these infants' capacity to discriminate sounds and found that in the group that was exposed to the lady who interacted with them, they were able to distinguish the sounds of Cantonese as well as their native language, just as well as the child raised in a Cantonese. We also know that language interactions need to be meaningful. So in the example of that research, they used reading books and they used engagement. So we know that actual engagement with the child is what is required. And recent research that's coming out of MIT this year is looking at the idea of conversational turns. So there was some seminal research that happened in the late 90s that showed that by the age of 3 years, children who had lived in a wealthier home were exposed to, on average, 3 million more words than children from an impoverished home. And this led to all sorts of ideas about needing to expose children to language. What this research is showing us is that it isn't so much the number of words that are important, it's the number of turns taken in a conversation. So if we focus solely on how many words and the words that are used, we miss the crucial relational element of language development. So it is about taking turns, how many times we take turns in a conversation. That is important for children. And keep in the back of your mind as we go through some of this, the implications for children that are potentially raised in neglectful environments or environments where they don't receive that type of interaction. We also know that, and from your own experience of interacting with infants, with little kids, that things like repetition are really important. We start talking to children before they have language. We use a high-pitched voice frequently. We repeat sounds. There's the constant, I guess, battle between parents for mum or dad to be said first. We repeat those words over and over again. And as a child learns language, it becomes what we repeat can become more complex, and our sentences become more complex. And the literature on language development has looked at this idea of educated parents, and there is a link between parental educational level and child's language development. And the factors that they are drawing from that is that it is the diversity in the number of words and the vocabulary and the syntactic structure that is actually important. That define, I guess, educated parents' language skills. And that they tend to ask more open-ended questions, which again makes sense because that actually encourages those conversational turns rather than questions that would close down the conversation. What's important is that literature also is telling us that the communication style of educated parents can be taught, and that can then have a positive impact on children's language development. You will find that many of our kids and teenagers who have experienced complex trauma will meet a lot of these, but they may have other more subtle impacts on their language. So if we look, it's again divided into understanding and speaking, which is your expressive and your receptive language skills. And some of them you'll see that there are things that actually reference the relational nature of language development. So on this slide, I think we've got babbles to get and keep attention. So imagine for a child that babbles and doesn't receive attention, or doesn't keep attention, or doesn't receive or keep attention consistently, what that then does. For a lot of children, we know a lot about neglect, but then they may stop seeking that attention. So I will flick through till you'll see they're all the same. They're divided into expressive and receptive. And throughout those years of language development, you'll see there's increasing complexity in number of words used in sounds and then number of words in understanding of language. And by the time a child reaches the age of 5 years, which in Australia is when most children start attending school, we would be expecting them to be able to take part in increasingly complex conversations involving turn-taking. So from around the age of 3, they can sort of take part in conversations, but they may not be particularly good at the turn-taking side of it, and they may go off topic, but by age 5 we're expecting them to be able to be involved in those conversations. And then from the age of 5 onwards, we add to language development the development of literacy skills, so reading and writing skills, which is another modality of communication, and that again builds in complexity across the school years. So they're your basic milestones. If you're thinking that a child or young person, we've got the children there, are not meeting those milestones, it would be potentially helpful to consult with a paediatrician or a speech language therapist with regards to that. This one is a slide I made up. It doesn't come from Speech Pathology Australia, but they do have wonderful resources that you can, and handouts that you can give families. But by the time we get to adolescence, something happens. And there are, I think adolescents can get a bit of a bad rap. But one of the things when we work with parents and carers, and they talk about constantly, is the struggle that they often have to communicate with adolescents. And their attempts to communicate with adolescents are often met with little in return. At times that's because of how they attempt to communicate with adolescents, and sometimes it is a feature of the complex tasks of adolescence, which Belinda is going to talk about now. And some of it's a feature of what's going on in adolescents' brain. So some of the characteristics of adolescence that we struggle with the most can be traced to changes that are happening in their brains and changes that are happening in their hormonal levels.
There is a lot of brain development that happens between 0 and 3. So 90% of your brain development will happen between that period of time. But there really are the crucial periods of time, and one of those is adolescence. Between the ages of about 10 and 13, there are 3 really main things happening. One of them is proliferation, and so that's the technical term, but basically that means that there is a whole lot of growth happening in your grey matter. So the bulk, I suppose, of your brain, and particularly in the front part. So I do a lot of this, like I point to my own brain. So a lot of that's happening in the front part of your brain. So there's lots of new cells being formed, but at the same time what's happening is this process called pruning and myelination, which is basically while lots is being developed, at the same time the ones that aren't being used frequently through, where there isn't the repetition and predictability, the connections between those parts of the brain start to fade away. But where there is repetition and predictability, I describe it as tar being laid down. So there's connections are being formed between those parts of the brain, and that is the myelinization process. So through that process, the pruning is getting rid of the ones you don't need. The myelinization is really embedding the connections that are being utilised. That continues for a really long time. Up until about the age of 40, we're continuing, and it's post that as well, but it continues up until the age of 40. We become more efficient in terms of the connections in our learning, but we don't cope as well with novel situations as that happens over time. So for adolescents, there is actually a whole bunch of things happening in their brain that mean that they will be struggling with the situations around them, with communication. I think that they're not always entirely responsible for the way that they are going from 0 to 10 in that very short period of time. So, very simply, your brain develops from the bottom to the top and the back to the front. Now, when you are born, your brain looks like your brain. However, the connections aren't there. And that is what develops over time. So when we're first born, obviously we're born with a brain stem, because we need that to be able to, which is fully functioning. And that is developing in utero. We need that to be able to survive. And in fact, within the first year of your life, 70% of the calories that you take in go towards brain development. So we grow from the bottom to the top, from the back to the front. So the first part that really starts to develop is that round bit there. Now that is called the cerebellum, and that is responsible for movement. So a lot happens between 0 and 2. Rolling over, learning to crawl, walking. It continues to develop, and the myelination continues to happen over the course of your life, but a lot is happening there between 0 and 2. And then from about 1 to 4, between 1 and 4, that middle part of the brain really starts to develop, and that's called our limbic system. And our limbic system is really responsible for expression of emotions. It's really impacted upon by attachment, and that's something that Laura and I really talk a lot about today, because attachment is just so important to all parts of our development. Language, ability to understand and talk about emotions, abilities to interact with other people, turn taking. There is so much that is impacted upon the relationship that we have with our primary caregivers when we are infants. The other thing about the limbic system is that it stores our feelings, it stores our unconscious memories, it evaluates sensory information for processing or forgetting. What can happen for children who are exposed to neglect and abuse is the memories of that will be stored there without actually a connection with what has happened. So there is a lack of a connection between the emotions that they feel and their experiences. A cognitive, an awareness of that, I suppose, is what I'm talking about. And then the next part that really starts to take off is the frontal lobe. So the front part of our brain, which is responsible for cause and effect thinking, impulse control, the storing of really explicit memories, the basis for self-reflection, all of those things. And so that's really from about, 3 or 4 years of age until it continues to grow and develop over time. We can all learn new skills even now. but it gets more difficult. So up to about the age of, I think it's 22 for women and about 24 for men, there is a continual growth in that frontal cortex and the laying down of the myelination so that the connections are strong there. But essentially, what's really important when we think about abuse experiences and trauma is that the organisation of the brain is sequential. So effectively, if we have really patterned and incoming neuroactivity which is consistent and appropriate, then you're going to have really good brain development and connections which are built. However, if you have dysregulation and inconsistency, then your brain is going to reflect that. That's where I think we really need to think about the children that we work with and the young people that we work with, that it is not impossible to change this. So by providing them with consistency and predictability and the opportunity to have really great relationships with people, we can actually impact on their ongoing brain development. But if they don't get those experiences, the longer that it takes, the harder that it is. But I do want the take-home message to be that it is not all done. Because I think sometimes we can get that, particularly when I say things like, 0 to 3 is the most important time. It is one of the most important times in your development, but it doesn't mean that we can't change things for these children and young people. Okay, so just very quickly about the adolescent brain. It's not complete, like I said, until the mid-20s. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for cause and effect, impulse control, organisation and priority setting, self-awareness and insight, and judgment and reasoning. There is so much happening there, which, it's funny because I think about when I read that, because I haven't done this presentation for quite a significant period of time, and like I said, I do have an adolescent, and I look at that now and I think, oh, that's probably why my daughter is struggling to figure out how to get all of her assignments completed without my assistance. I think we get to a point that sometimes we just assume that our children, particularly as they are in adolescence, that they work in the exact same way we do. And every now and then it's time to have a bit of a reflection and realise that it is our job, even when it's difficult, to actually be the people that help them figure this stuff out. And organisation and priority setting is probably something that I need to be a little bit more helpful with. Okay, so also important that young people use different parts of their brain to make decisions. No surprise. They're working from the emotional part of their brain. I think we can all agree on that. So the cause and effect, the figuring things out from this part of their brain is not as online for us. They will make decisions based on their emotions and their limbic system. And it's our job to help them get their cortex online by staying calm as much as we can and not getting into the to and fro that can happen when they're working from their emotional side of the brain. Sometimes easier said than done. So the most important job of any brain is to ensure survival. And that is so true. Complex trauma is trauma that occurs. I think the most important thing about complex trauma is the way that I think about it is the person that is meant to be looking after you is causing you harm. And that is either, through physical abuse or through neglect. It's the person who is meant to look after you is not the person that is caring about you. That makes it really difficult for you to develop in the best way possible. Of course, it occurs in childhood and adolescence. I probably need to take that bit out. And so we are talking about sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, and witnessing domestic violence. These factors really impact on the development of a child. And they impact Okay, I'm a bit out of whack here. They impact it because trauma does ignite the fight, flight or freeze response. That's your limbic system, so trauma ignites your limbic system. We are basically wired for survival. That is how we've all heard about fight, flight and freeze. If a tiger came in the room now, that's just going to be triggered without us even thinking about that. That's what it's like for these children every day. Their fight, flight or freeze is being set off. So they develop what really are probably quite adaptive responses to survive. So it might be that they learn to be very, very quiet. Because if you're loud, that means that you're going to cop it. Or they might learn that they can't actually get out. They're stuck. They can't fight and they can't run away. So they freeze. And that's really, that's quite adaptive for them. But then over time, that freezing means that they may dissociate when they're in class as a response to some trigger that we may or may not even be aware of. Or they don't develop the ability, not even the ability, but they don't learn that they can express how that they feel. So conversations with them, if they're adolescents, for example, will often be, I don't know, maybe, because they're too afraid to actually have their own voice. These were adaptive responses when they were in that situation, but they can become quite maladaptive patterns of behaviour, but goodness, you can see why they're there. And what will happen is we can get an overdevelopment, so the tar is being put down over the limbic system and an underdevelopment of their frontal lobe. So complex trauma really impacts on these 5 areas. And we'll go through them very quickly, but one of the things, complex trauma does impact clearly on behaviour, but Laura and I were discussing this last night, and really it's quite a silly thing to put there because it doesn't impact on behaviour, it manifests in their behaviour. And so we really need to remember that the behaviour that we see from the kids that we work with every day is adaptive for them, and it is a manifestation of what's happened for them. And I think that it's just so important to remember that a complex trauma doesn't impact on behaviour. The behaviour is there because of the complex trauma. Okay. So attachment, that relationship that we have in those first few years of our life, it is the model for how we see ourselves, the world and others. Every time a baby cries or smiles or giggles and they get a response from that, what do they learn? If that response is, oh, I'm going to soothe you, or aren't you fun today, or you start to read and sing nursery rhymes, that type of thing, if they get a positive response to their behaviour, what do they learn? They learn that I am a good person, I'm worthwhile. They learn that somebody will be there for them. People can be trusted. They learn that the world is a safe place. There are these internal working models that then guide how they see themselves, the world and others. If that doesn't happen, if one day you get a reaction, or 1 hour you get a reaction, and the next hour you don't get a reaction, or worse still, the reaction is something which promotes fear within you, what do these children learn? They learn that they are not safe. The world is not a safe place. People don't care about me. People can't be trusted. And I'm not a good person. And that is actually happening pretty much from the time we are born. It is those ongoing interactions that happen hundreds of times a day with your caregiver that really set how you will see the world, yourself and others. So if that doesn't happen, what might happen is you might lack personal boundaries because you need to figure out how to get at the attention. So some of the, these are the kids that we meet that we've never ever met before, but they'll come and sit on our laps. Or they'll struggle to really find relationships safe. So these kids are going to try and push you away before they let you in because you can't be trusted. They don't want to be part of this. They're quite suspicious of you, and they're really going to have difficulty attuning to other people's emotions. So they're also going to struggle to talk about their own emotions. Because when a baby cries, what do we say? Oh, you're okay, you're sad, you're upset. We actually start to say those words right from the time they're born. When they giggle and they're happy, we say, we'll sing with them, or we'll give meaning and words to the experiences and the feelings that they're having, and that's how they internalise that and learn that for themselves. If you don't have that, it makes it really difficult. No surprise, what do we find? How many of the young people you work with or children you work with, people worry that they have autism? That's so common. Is it autism? I don't really think so. I think it is just a manifestation of the fact that they did not get the experiences that they needed when they were infants. The other thing is, they have an uncertainty about the reliability and the predictability of the world, because reliability and predictability promotes survival, it promotes well-being, it promotes healthy brain development, it promotes healthy development between relationship development. If you don't have that, one of the things that these children will do is they will become quite oppositional and controlling. And they do that because if you can control others, then at least then you know that your needs will be met. Okay, so I've already sort of spoken about this. Complex trauma clearly impacts on affect. It will impact on your self-regulation, children's ability to regulate themselves and to develop good coping mechanisms happen, again, through the relationship that they have with their caregiver, through modelling, but through responses to their own behaviour. The understanding of your own and others' feelings and internal states. But often also these children have difficulty communicating even what they desire and what they wish. And part of that is, I'll talk a little bit in the next 2 slides or something about self-concept. But often children exposed to trauma struggle to develop a really coherent sense of self. They don't know who they are, and that is because they've not had the experience of being able to, within a relationship where they're seen as good and worthwhile people. So they really struggle to develop that, which is quite difficult when they then hit adolescence. What is the main goal of adolescence? Well, there's 2 of them. Separating from your parents and developing a sense of identity. Geez, that's hard when you don't have a base that you're a good person. Okay. So there you go. So often they'll have quite an unpredictable sense of who they are. And often these kids don't feel they're unique, which then there can be body image problems, low self-esteem, really susceptible to the influence of others because, gosh, you want to fit in and figure it out. And there's often a really high level of shame. And I've wrote shame and guilt there, but it's really shame. Guilt is not a bad thing for children. Now, I'll put this in context. So, a child that has grown up in a loving environment and they do the wrong thing, let's face it, as parents, we want them to feel guilty. That's a fact. Because if they feel guilty, then they're likely to change their behaviour. They feel guilty about the way they've behaved. They don't feel shame about themselves because they know that even if they are naughty, we still love them. The guilt means that they might, hopefully, behave differently next time. That's very different to shame. Shame is around how you feel about yourself, that you are not worthwhile, that people don't care for you. Shame can trigger, it can be a trigger for a memory. Shame can be a trigger for behaviour. Experiences of shame are quite high for children who have been exposed to complex trauma. Okay, so there he was sort of talking about this is really the manifestation of complex trauma. But what we often see in our children is that they have under-controlled or over-controlled behaviour. Not surprisingly, most people don't complain about the over-controlled behaviour because they're the children that are very They'll follow the rules. They're the children where when you speak to the carer, they say, oh no, they've just fitted in fine. They've slotted right in. They're not a problem. So that's a bit weird. Really, all things considered, that's, imagine if any of our children had to go and live, they would not cope. They would not just be really controlled in their behaviour. It's a maladaptive response that they've developed. The under control behaviour is often what results in a referral to us, I suppose. It's what bothers school teachers. But they're both equally problematic. The impaired impulse control and self-destructive behaviour. The other thing about over-control behaviour and excessive compliance, it's really, I think, important to think about what that might end up looking like for young women. So having worked with the adolescent team for quite a period of time, you will often find that these young ladies and young women will be involved in relationships that are quite similar to their experiences of childhood, so that they will go into relationships that are where there are incidences of domestic violence, where they are controlled and exploited. This is really related to their experiences in childhood. There can be sleeping problems, and partly that's about, not feeling safe enough to go to sleep, or their brain not switching off, the fight or flight response being triggered, appetite problems. So there can be, we often see some hoarding of food with these children, worried, even though there is regular access to food, that they're worried that there won't be enough there. So there's that no ability to switch off your appetite, and self-soothing behaviours. And that, they can be rocking, they might be other sexualised type behaviours that we see in children exposed to abuse, but these are all related to their experiences. It's how, and I think the important thing in the context of today, is how they are communicating to us. Behaviour serves a communication purpose. In terms of language, so complex trauma impacts on your cognition and language. Poor attention regulation, so that's partly around the brain development, but it's also around the fact that if you have been living in a constant state of fear, it's really difficult to pay attention on what you need to, because you're very focused, and whether it's a conscious awareness or not, these children are on the lookout for danger a lot, because that's how they've kept themselves safe. That then obviously has a flow-on effect to memory. If you're sitting in class and you've either dissociated or you are concentrating on everything around you to keep yourself safe, it's very hard to pay attention to what the teacher's talking about at the front of the class. There can also be problems with organisation, judgment and problem solving, and learning and cognitive difficulties. Now, I know there has been some research which shows that children who've been exposed to abuse and neglect will often have, on an intellectual assessment, a lower score on their verbal, because there's two parts to an intellectual assessment, a verbal and a non-verbal part. So their non-verbal intelligence might actually be in the normal or higher range, but their verbal intelligence is lower, and that is really related to the environment and the fact that they've not had those experiences that resulted in good language development. Often also what happens is memory and emotions aren't stored with their experiences. So it can be quite difficult for children to know what's triggered them, because those two things aren't stored well together. And I think you all would have come across this, but when we talk to kids about their life, their present and past is really mixed up. So I know from when I've been working with young people, we'll do life maps about their life and talk about their experiences, and they can talk about something that happened 10 years ago, because you know it happened 10 years ago because you've had a look through their files, as though it was yesterday. So it's something we talk about a little bit later, but it is really important to help children develop a good story about their life that helps them put things in order.
So as Belinda mentioned, language is a component of cognition. We are dealing with it separately today, just pulling out some of the specific impacts on language, on the relationships between trauma and language. There are a lot of limitations in the literature on this topic. A lot of what we know about trauma and across a broad range of domains comes from studies on adults. So it's really hard to disentangle other impacts of things that have happened in the adults' lives. But they're starting to do some quite good research, and a lot of it's actually coming out of Australia, which is really good for the work that we're doing. We spoke briefly before about the language characteristics or the language style of parents with higher education levels and wealthier families. So just to kind of review, these are some of the things that the literature is saying that children who have early experiences of mistreatment might have experienced in their language environment. And that is less active and responsive language, which, as we spoke about, affects attachment, not responding to a child. And the decreased attunement, so that is the recognition of what a child is trying to communicate or what a child needs and being able to respond to that. So that affects those conversational turn-taking. They also have, which is quite relevant, more aversive language experiences. And if you think about verbal abuse on its own or in a domestically violent relationship, these children are exposed to more negative language interactions. And overall, caregivers have been shown to have decreased complexity in their sentence structure and the vocabulary that they use. And they ask fewer questions, and specifically, as we mentioned before, fewer open-ended questions. So I want to preface all of this by saying there's huge variability in the language skill of the children that we work with. You're going to have children who've experienced complex trauma who score in the superior range on language assessments and cognitive assessments. It's really not possible to derive one single syndrome of complex trauma. So when we talk about it, we're talking generally about some of the things that are coming up when groups of children who've experienced maltreatment have been studied. And or in this case, their parents and their parents' or caregivers' language style. So there is huge variability. And we also know, which is good for the work that we're doing and what is referred to as the buffering hypothesis, but that the presence of a supportive person, any form of social support, can buffer the effects of stress, including toxic stress. And we know that for ourselves. When we're experiencing stress, the presence of social support can be helpful. It's the same for our children, and sometimes, as we'll speak about, caseworkers and other workers within the child protection system can be that source of support for a child or young person. So whilst there isn't a lot of agreement in the literature around some of the specific impacts, there is general consensus that experiences of maltreatment affects expressive and receptive language abilities. And these are independent of socioeconomic factors. So that relationship that we spoke about between wealth and poverty and language skills, it's independent of that because they'll study people and control for socioeconomic factors in these studies. So it's actually impacting on language skills. But what they're starting to look at now is social skills and language skills, and that's quite important because pragmatic language skills or all language skills are essential to survive in the social world that we live in. You need to be able to communicate to be able to survive socially. And so they're actually looking at this as a separate but related construct, and what they've found is that neglect, rather than other forms of abuse, seems to have quite a significant impact on social skills. And that will make sense in some of the work that we do. But sometimes the effects on language can be quite subtle, and you can have subtle effects in difficulties in comprehension and the social use of language. So I have recently been working with a young person, a 15-year-old, and she was referred for concerns about safety and the risk of sexual exploitation. Although the work that we were doing was also very much around emotional regulation. She, after having worked with her for a little while, I discovered that she'd had 2 cognitive assessments done, one done in 2011 and one done in 2016, both of which showed she had an IQ in the moderately impaired range. Despite this, she actually presented with really, I won't say good because it turns out it's not real good, but on the surface seemingly good vocabulary and expressive language skills. So when you talk to her, she will give you an answer, offer an answer using lots of words and sometimes big words. And if you have brief interactions with her, you may not realise that some of the time she doesn't actually understand what she's saying, or what she's saying doesn't quite make sense. You sometimes think, actually, I'm not quite sure what that answer just was. And you have this kind of moment of internal dialogue with yourself. And I think as a result of the way that she presents, she also physically presents very well. Not a lot's been done with either of those cognitive assessments in terms of actually doing further assessment about her adaptive functioning, further assessment about her language functioning, or putting some things in place to support this young person to get the help that she needs to function at her best level of functioning. So we are looking at further assessments now, but she's now 15, and the first assessment occurred 6 years ago, it's nearly 7 years ago. So a lot more could have been potentially put in place over that 7-year period. So bearing in mind that we sometimes get a different impression from the children and young people that we're working with, we focus a lot on the kids that present quite obviously with difficulties, but sometimes those effects are subtle, or they have adapted and compensate for some of their difficulties and have these great compensatory skills, but sometimes mean that we miss areas of intervention. So most of you will be familiar with the literature around suggestibility and leading questions, which tells us a lot about how we ask children questions is important in what information we get from them. Interestingly, a lot of that research has not been done on children who have experienced abuse or neglect. It's been just done on general samples taken from primary schools. They're changing that recently and looking at that. So this is obviously particularly relevant for the investigative type conversations that some of you have to have in the course of your roles. But I think more broadly, in terms of all of the conversations that we have, it becomes quite relevant when we look at the impact of experiences of abuse and neglect on children's suggestibility. And what recent Australian research is showing, and they looked specifically at neglect and had the hypothesis that neglect would have a specific impact. And what they found was that neglect increased a child's suggestibility or likelihood of yielding to a leading question. And that was independent of their language skill, of their cognitive level, of the amount of time they had spent in out-of-home care, of the age of onset of the neglect, so the length of time they had been neglected for, independent of their behaviour. So they controlled all these other variables and are looking at this idea that neglect increases suggestibility. What they then looked at was social skills and suggestibility. And they found that children with higher social skills were more likely to yield to leading questions. So the children that we actually think are more functional are the ones that are more vulnerable to yielding to leading questions, which lends the hypothesis that this is actually an adaptation, because a child who acquiesces to an adult in a neglectful environment is more likely to get their needs met than a child that doesn't. But on the surface, they're quite functioning. They seem to be quite good functioning. They're the kids that will have better social skills, be able to make friends, be able to engage with adults, but actually are vulnerable to yielding to leading questions. So really kind of thinking about how we ask questions with the children and young people that we work with. And we are all guilty of every now and again asking leading questions. It's particularly when you've got a kid in front of you that doesn't answer questions. Your questions get kind of more and more closed as you're trying to engage and get a response from that. So it's just something to keep in the back of your mind. The idea of grammatical negations, which is up there, is also relatively recent research, and that's looking at the use of words like don't, can't, want. So I don't cry when I kick somebody would be a grammatical negation. It's considered to be a more complex language skill that starts to develop between the ages of 2 and 3. And the complexity comes from being able to use contractions in a fixed syntactic position, etc. I won't bore you with the details, but they think it's a more complex skill. And interestingly, experiences of maltreatment is related to increased grammatical negations, which may also reflect the worldview and self-concept impacts of complex trauma that Belinda was talking about. But on a potentially positive side, there is an argument that perhaps it's also an adaptation to allow children to express their negative experiences. And we know that talking about negative experiences is the first step in healing of those negative experiences, as long as it's done in an appropriate fashion. So they actually improved in their capacity to talk about negative experiences. And they look at all sorts of things in terms of storytelling. So compared to a group that hadn't experienced abuse, they weren't as good at the retelling of a positive themed story, for example, but they're better, the same as or better at the retelling of a negatively themed story. So different things like that are lending some information towards this idea that these adaptations to their early experiences of complex trauma are facilitating their communication of some of the things that might have actually happened to them. And then it's up to us to give the opportunities for those conversations to actually occur. And there is, on the positive note, recent literature that's also suggesting that out-of-home care placements may impact positively on the acquisition of language skill. And that comes down to particularly looking at the education level of carers, so carers with a higher education level, and therefore those language features that we discussed earlier, the children's language is actually responding positively just to living in that environment. What doesn't change and what doesn't seem to respond to the out-of-home care environment is social skills, and that may be something that we need to explicitly teach. So now we're going to talk about some of the things that go wrong, or some of the barriers to effective communication, and we're going to use some of our own experiences, including the times when things didn't go right, and they're some of the most powerful lessons that we can have. And where do we go from here, and what can we actually do to have meaningful and effective communication interactions with the children and young people that we work with? So having an agenda, we all have an agenda. It's how we structure ourselves and kind of get organised. But having your own agenda, which is often influenced by the organisational agenda, the tasks that you need to achieve in your roles with these children and young people, can become a barrier. And when I was preparing this presentation, I was reflecting on one of my earliest, my first role as a clinical psychologist was in a child protection counselling service. I worked for health prior to working for community services. And I worked with this lovely young boy who had been referred for behavioural problems, as lots of them are. And I think it was very early on in our treatment, but I went in with this beautiful treatment plan. So as psychologists, we come up with an overall treatment plan, then we have individual session plans, which is kind of similar to the agenda that you might have when you have a conversation with a child or young person. I can't even remember what we were doing, but I remember it was quite a good session plan. So I go in with this session plan. And as a result of me trying to get through my session plan, the more experience you get, the more flexible you become in your session plans. But I was trying to kind of do these activities that I had sort of planned to address the need that I think we had identified the previous session in terms of what we were going to work on this session. And I've missed all of his cues. And he, as a result, ran out of the room. This is my first position as a clinical psychologist, so I followed him and, thinking I've got to make sure he's safe, but also I can't lose a kid in my first job. And the counselling service was at Royal North Shore Hospital. And before they did all the work, I don't know what it looks like now, but there was a giant tree in Royal North Shore Hospital, and it was right on the walkway from the train station to the main hospital. So he climbs said tree. I follow him, and he's proceeding to hurl obscenities like some of these well-heeled ladies had never heard before at me from the tree. I'm red-faced under the tree thinking, what the hell am I supposed to do with this situation? How do I get the kid down from the tree? I'm not climbing the tree. Took a step back, took a deep breath, thought about what is his behaviour communicating to me, and the closer I got to him, the worse the obscenities became. So I withdrew a little and talked to him the whole time and was able to kind of explain to him I was just going to sit here, and whenever he was ready to get down from the tree, we could go and play a game, we could do whatever he kind of wanted to do. He did come down from the tree, fortunately, and then he proceeded to kind of make a game of hiding behind various things and watching to make sure I was following him, which was his attempt to re-engage with me and to repair the relationship rupture. We got back to the counselling centre. I could return him to his grandmother who was waiting, and all was well. We didn't address any of that session. We spoke about it the next time I saw him. But because I had been so focused on doing my treatment plan and what I thought this child needed, missed his cues. He had a fight-flight reaction. He had a flight reaction, he fled. And then when I followed, he had a fight reaction in the yelling at me to kind of stay away. So it happens to all of us. You do have to, at some times, complete tasks in your roles. I've got another young man at the moment, 12-year-old, who refuses to speak to his caseworker. His caseworker is wonderful. She's tried a lot of things, very psychologically minded, and her and I have worked together on various strategies to try and engage him, but he flat out refuses to speak to her. So a casework specialist did an audit, and this particular case was one of the cases that was audited and came up with a number of red flags because this child had not been involved in his case planning because he refused to actually answer any of the questions that were asked of him. So we together came up with a plan, the caseworker and the casework specialist, about whether or not I could ask some questions and have input into his case plan that way. So I had a conversation with this young boy, and he was prepared for me to ask him certain questions, knowing that they were the casework questions that I would feed back around things like when he wanted to see certain family members, what kinds of activities he wanted to be involved in and things like that. And that's worked well in making sure he has a voice in his case plan, but in allowing him to control his relationship with his caseworker, which is his way of controlling his relationship with community services. And he needs to have that control to feel safe. So we've come at it a different way. So I encourage you all to think outside the box when it comes to trying to meet organisational agendas and those tasks, at the same time maintaining our children's need for control and for safety, however that manifests. Then we have discomfort all the way through to fear, kind of a continuum of emotions that can really get in the way. And I've had caseworkers and psychologists who I supervise actually say to me that they're afraid of certain children or young people for a variety of different reasons. That's not a really tenable and helpful position to be in when you have to work with a child or young person. Because what anxiety, discomfort or fear results in is avoidance, and we then avoid having the conversations. And it might be, just avoidance of going a certain place in a conversation and having one of those important conversations. And so oftentimes we underestimate the children and young people that we work with because they're expecting in many cases or wanting to talk about some of these issues, and then the whole time there's this elephant in the room of the things that aren't said. So really being able to have that and seek supervision around having some of those conversations and working with your own emotional response to having some of those conversations can be helpful. A few of our previous presenters have spoken about time pressures, so I won't really go into it very much, but I think that the tasks that you all have to juggle and the jobs that you have to do, it is a real challenge of the work that we do, and the plan you have for your day, I suspect very rarely goes to plan. Misattunement we've also spoken about. That's missing those cues, and the example I gave with my young man up the tree was an example of misattunement. Dismissive and invalidating responses. The research has shown us that dismissive responses is the primary parenting response. It's often well-intentioned, so a dismissive response might be, oh, don't cry, everything's going to be okay. So it's a well-intentioned response, but you're actually shutting down conversation. That said, you don't need to kind of explore every child's every emotion at all the time or you'd get nothing done, but it's bearing in mind when to have the conversations, when to open up those conversations, and how some of your responses might be perceived by the child. Self-monitoring is a big one that we also get when we supervise younger psychologists or we consult with caseworkers. But we all do it to some extent. That's that kind of conversation you have with yourself inside your head when you're actually talking to somebody else about, well, what am I going to say next? What did they mean by that? Maybe I should go down a different avenue. What are they thinking of me? And things like being observed by your colleagues, which is also up there, can actually increase that self-monitoring, especially if you're not familiar with that colleague or haven't worked very much with them before. You kind of have this internal dialogue, and that can get in the way of attunement and engagement with a child or young person. So bearing in mind that some of those things can be barriers. The disconnection between the verbal and non-verbal, so disconnection between what you say and what you do, how you present on a particular day. Kids will pick up on that, and it can sometimes be really threatening. So I know, for example, I get migraines, and after a migraine I have what I call my migraine hangover. The migraine's gone, but I'm a bit blunted in my affect. If I'd had a migraine the night before and I went to work and I was to be a bit blunted and I was seeing a child, a young person or a parent or a caregiver, sometimes I will say, I might seem a bit different to you today. That's just because I wasn't feeling very well, but I'm fine now. So that they know that it's about me and it's not about them. Teachers will often, talk about it when I do training with teachers. I say, the day that you need these kids to behave, the day that you've got, you've just received a huge bill or you've got a million things to do or the car's broken down, the day you're super stressed is the day they're most likely to muck up. And that's because they pick up on those changes in you, and stress and changes in your presentation can be threatening for a child or a young person and trigger a fight-flight reaction. I'd worked with the grandmother of the boy that was up the tree. I did a lot of work with her as well, and she was a beautiful woman working really hard to meet the needs of her 4 grandchildren who were in her care. And she said to me one day, she was Papua New Guinean, and she talked a lot about the cultural differences of raising children in Australia versus her experiences as a child in Papua New Guinea. And she said to me one day in frustration, I don't get why these boys keep telling me they're sorry. They tell me they're sorry, and they just keep doing it. She said, in my language, we have no word for sorry, because sorry is not something that you say, sorry is something that you do. And I think these kinds of the way we use language and construct meaning around things, and the differences between what we say and what we do are really crucial. And if we pick up on it, the kids that we work with pick up on it too. Emotional arousal, as we've spoken about, managing your own emotions, is essential in working with these kids. So what's their experience from these potential barriers? And then we could have done slides and slides and slides on barriers and things that can go wrong in communication, but we picked the main ones. But what the child essentially experiences is this disconnection. They already have trouble connecting, so experiencing further disconnection can really reinforce their ideas around relationships. They experience that misattunement and being misunderstood. You don't understand me. We get that a lot. There's no point telling the caseworker they don't understand me. There's no point telling my teacher I've tried before. I tell them over and over again, nobody understands me. We can have an anxiety or fear response in these kids. That's that threat system being triggered by some of the things that they perceive in interactions, even if it's not our intention. They can really experience an incongruence, a difference between what they feel and what's happening, what you're saying and what you're feeling, which results in further distrust and fear. And again, they've already got significant problems trusting people, so sometimes these interactions can reinforce those concepts of distrust. And they can experience that hopelessness. There's no point, nothing's going to change, I've tried this before. All of those things result in an affect dysregulation. We're all familiar with the escalation as a form of affect dysregulation, but affect dysregulation involves escalation and it involves shutting down. That's also a form of affect dysregulation. So when we sometimes run into one of these barriers in our communication interactions, we could have a child escalate in our wherever we're talking to them, or we can have them completely shut down. And then we're getting nothing, and we don't get to actually achieve the things that we need to achieve with these kids.
Okay, so some helpful tips. Firstly, it's important to remember we are often the only consistent people for some of these children that we work with. We say these children, I prefer our children, I don't know what you prefer. It's our job to help our children have a voice. We are the voice for the kids that we see every day. We need to, the reason I've spoken, and we've spoken a lot about complex trauma, is we need to keep their experiences in mind, because when we do that, we have a greater ability to have patience and empathy. We need to let carers also have an understanding of the experiences of the children they are caring for. If we want them to see their behaviour as a response to what they've been through and to understand them, they need to know a little bit about that. We know that change occurs through the development of positive and consistent relationships, and that is you and me and their carers and their school teacher and the important people in their lives and their parents. Establish trust. Do what you say you will. Don't promise something you won't deliver. Children will smell bullshit. Be honest with them. You know, I know we only have 5 minutes, but the most honest I've ever been is I've worked for a long time with the young woman whom I care for greatly, and I allowed her to do my makeup at the end of one of our sessions. Young people love bronzer, I have to say, but she came to me with an eyelash curler. I don't even use an eyelash curler. I was shitting myself. And I looked at her and I said to her, I'm putting so much trust in you right now because this is freaking me out. I wasn't going to sit there and pretend that I was okay with her coming towards me with an eyelash curler, because that thing sticks on your eye and then they squeeze it. And now that didn't give her a sense of power. It actually made her see that I was putting a lot of trust in her, but it's okay to talk about those things as well. I was being really honest in that situation. I let her do it. She didn't pull my eyebrows out. I knew she wouldn't, my eyelashes out, but it was frightening. And You know, I'm always really honest with the children that I work with and the young people that I work with, and you'll see very quickly in a minute one of the cards, because we've spoken a lot today about resources that you can utilise, and I love resources, but so I found the resources that I had didn't quite hit the mark, so I made a card of my own. Keep their cortex online, so stay calm. So that's part of our job, stay calm when they're not, because that's how we're helping them model and keep their cortexes online. It's, you know, Laura was just talking about that. Validate their emotion, and we've had so much discussion today from really great people around how we can do that. Don't jump to advice giving, because when we do that, we do bypass their limbic system. Teenagers will cry because they've broken up with their boyfriend or girlfriend. The worst thing to do is say there's more fish in the sea. We all want to do that, we know there is, but we really just have to say it's okay, it'll be all right. We need to listen to them, not just the words, but their behaviour. And we need to help them build a narrative about their life. So this is a card that I developed. So we need to remember that eye contact can be threatening. Children can often find it easier to talk when they're engaged in a task, whether it's feeling cards, and it's not quite a feeling card, but I have these reflections cards, and I've worked with this young man for a period of time. We'd often use these reflection cards, and he was going through a lot, and he looked at me and I looked at him, and we both agreed that there really wasn't a card there that was appropriate. So then the next week I made this card, and it actually doesn't have the little bits on it. I got somebody to do that for me, and we put all the cards out again, and he looked at me and he said, yeah, that's it. Life is not great sometimes, and it's definitely not great for these kids sometimes. And we just really need to acknowledge that. Maybe I should have stopped there, but I can't, because I need to talk about UNO. If you take nothing from today, other than the fact that you should go and buy UNO, then I'll be happy. UNO is the best tool to use with children and adolescents, because you can be talking and doing something. You don't need to put a whole lot of thought into UNO. So it's, you know, you can sit there and play UNO. But if you've got a child that's really, you know, you want to build some engagement, you can lose UNO without them knowing. So you might have a draw 4, don't put it down. Let them win. But at the same time, if you've worked with someone for quite a period of time and you can have a bit of fun, or if in my case I've been doing a bit of, you know, emotional regulation and helping them to learn other techniques to deal with anger, I don't mind smashing down draw 2 after draw 2, followed by a reverse and then another draw 2, because you can see if what you've done works or not.
But as we have said, communication is the key to effective communication is connection. Build a relationship first. So I can't give you tools to use at different developmental stages, because each child is different. You have to get to know the child first and find out what they like and engage them around those issues and have those conversations with them. We all have a basic desire to be heard and understood, so do the kids and teenagers that we work with. And they experience difficulties in connection, so be mindful of that. Use of language is idiosyncratic, but use of language is also powerful. I'm reminded, and I'll use the example from our team of casework specialists in Western New South Wales. I met with them the other day, and they are looking at, just within their own practice, can they change the meaning around this idea of birth family contact, which is the language we use and kids now use and teachers use, and when a kid asks when have I next got contact is actually pretty awful, but can we change the meaning around that by changing our discursive practices? Can we use different words and change the meaning that children develop? So clarifying with kids, making sure we know what they're saying, checking in with them are all important concepts. Your agenda is not going to be the same as the child's agenda. You will go further in achieving your agenda if you first meet their needs. Talk with versus talking to or talking at children, and that is the focus of today, is about talking with children, which is beautiful. And be aware of what your body and your face are doing, because the majority of what you say comes from what your body language and those non-verbal avenues of communication. And if you ever need to, please consult with the psychologist in your local CSC. We're more than happy to talk about issues with regards to how to talk to children or what they might be communicating, what their behaviour might be communicating, or share some of our resources with you that might help with engagement with children.